Hello and welcome to another video. Halloween is just around the corner, so let's paint a pumpkin patch with watercolor pencils. Let's begin by painting the outline. Pumpkins are really easy to paint. I start by drawing an oval shape in the center of the paper. I then add the stem. Adding the stem now means that I do not have to erase pencil lines later in order to add it. I know exactly where the lines for the other parts of the pumpkin will start. Next, I add one more segment to either side of the oval shape. The segments I'm currently painting are higher than the central oval shape. This will give me a three-dimensional effect. Now I add some segments to the back of the pumpkin. This will make it appear like I'm looking at the pumpkin slightly from above. Some of the creases in the pumpkin are hidden behind the stem. Let's also add some veins to make the painting more interesting. I first draw the center vein and then add some smaller ones branching off from it. You can add more pumpkins, veins, leaves and details to your outline. For today's painting, I decided to paint 2 pumpkins and add a lot more detail by adding more veins and leaves. To add leaves, I draw an upside down U shape. I add an upside down V on top of it and then I add 2 more V's to either side. To connect the V's with the U shape, I'm painting another U shape. Well, and this easy leaf is finished. Let me show you which colors I picked for today's illustration. Burnt sienna is used for the background and the stems. I need 2 different greens for the veins and the leaves. I will paint 2 pumpkins with slightly different color schemes. One pumpkin will be yellow and orange and the other one will be orange and red. Feel free to swap the colors I picked for any other colors you like. What about, let's say, pink and magenta for the pumpkin and blue veins? Layering is my favorite tool when it comes to watercolor pencil paintings, and it's the most important tool you have to make your paintings pop. For the first layer, I use the lighter colors, and with every layer, my color choices become darker and more intense. To increase the contrast, I will leave the highlights white or almost white. Every of my pencil lines and every brush stroke must follow the same direction, as the lines might not dissolve completely and might still be visible in the final artwork. When one of the lines is going the wrong way, it will really stand out and distract from the final piece. The direction of the lines on the pumpkin go vertically, meaning from the stem at the top to the hidden stem at the bottom. The color testing I did before when selecting my colors really pays off now. From my tests, I know that the yellow becomes really intense and vibrant when activated. I use it lightly for this layer. I also add some green to the leaves and a little bit of brown to the stems. Having the light first layer added will make it easier to increase the colors later with more layers. I do not have to leave white highlights on the stem or leaves. Instead, I chose to go for a light color highlights. Adding too much detail and leaving white highlights in the stem, for example, would draw attention away from the highlights on the pumpkin, the main subject of this painting. Using a light green wash, for example, is a great alternative to white highlights. I like to make things easy. A quick touch with a wet brush to the stem and the green leaves is enough to activate the watercolor pencil. They don't need to be perfect right now, and the lines do not need to be perfectly straight now. This is just a first layer, and it's good enough if they are activated at all. Once the first layer of orange and yellow watercolor pencil is on the paper, I start to dissolve it with a wet brush. I add some clean water to the white highlights first, just to make it easier on myself to create soft edges there. I do not want any hard lines separating the colored areas from the white highlights. When one wet area touches another wet area, the pigment can bleed. Keep this in mind when you start to activate the watercolor pencil, especially the brighter colors like the yellow ones. Watercolor pencil does, in general, dry pretty fast, so you don't have to take a long break between the two pumpkins. Even when there is some bleeding of the colors happening, I personally embrace it, as it gives the pumpkin more character. Before adding the next layer of watercolor pencil to the pumpkin, the orange and yellow watercolor pigment need to dry. The wet paper is fragile, and using the pencils on wet paper will activate the pencils, creating really strong pigmented lines, which are really hard to dissolve and redistribute with a wet brush. I use the drying time to add some color to the veins. I use the light green to follow the lines from the original outline. I won't press too hard, as this is the first layer. My plan is to add more layers, just following almost exactly the previous lines. With every new green layer added, I will press a little harder, adding more pigment, making the colors darker and less translucent. I did not add any of the green watercolor pencil earlier, because even when it's dry, you can smudge it when you rub over it with your hand too much. When activating this layer, I'm not too careful to follow the lines exactly, or even stay within a certain area. These veins are translucent, and I want them to look a little washed out in areas, making the painting more interesting. This also adds to the whole look of a loose painting. When the first layer is fully dry, I begin to add more watercolor pencil to increase the colors. This layer is about starting to define the shadows and simply to increase the colors. I use red for the pumpkin on the left and orange for the pumpkin on the right. I add the pigment to the shaded areas of the pumpkin. The shaded areas here are the creases of the pumpkin as well as the bottom area. I will darken the top area of the pumpkin where the stem is later. I add some color to the leaves as well, and I use the lighter green to add the next layer to the veins. For the veins, I press the watercolor pencil a little harder this time, making the lines more solid than before. This can be a little hard to see as the green pencils are really light before I activate them. I need to trust my experience and the color sample which I created. I feel like experimenting a little today, so I add a light layer of a darker green pigment to some veins. This will create even more variation in the color. Since the darker green color is not a solid line, it will not appear like a full line. It will more suggest light shadows. It's a broken up line. Don't get hung up on placing the shadows in realistic places. It really is not important here. Let's start to activate the watercolor pencil. Just like before, I just loosely follow the green lines with my wet brush, not caring too much about perfection. This is the point where I notice how one corner of the tape keeps rolling up. I'm not working with a lot of water here, so there's no need to tape down the painting, other than to keep it in the frame of my camera. I didn't want to risk ripping the paper by using new tape, which is super sticky, so I just reused some tape. It was not as bad when I filmed the video, but now while editing, it just looks hilarious how I keep fighting with the tape. I replaced it with another piece of reused tape just to have it roll up on me again as well. Sometimes you just can't win. Let's activate the watercolor pencils on the pumpkins. The pencils I'm using have quite a strong pigmentation. A lot of pigment is soaking up in the brush, being transported by it. This is not a bad thing, but something I need to be aware of. I try to move all the extra pigment to the shaded area at the bottom of the pumpkin. I also use the extra pigment in the brush to darken the top area near the stem. I use the exact same method to dissolve the watercolor pencil on the yellow pumpkin. Let's start with the next layer. This part is very satisfying to see in a time lapse. I bring out the shadows and make the pumpkin pop off the paper. This is where the painting really comes to life. I darken the creases of the pumpkin. The light source is coming from the front, so each rounded segment is casting a shadow on the piece of the pumpkin right behind it. The previous shadows were more broad shadows. These shadows in this layer are really defined. I will add another layer with the darkest colors in my palette only. For the pumpkin on the left, this will be red. In the layer I'm currently working on, I should not use the pure red because I will need this as my darkest color in the next layer. I mix in some orange to the red in this layer just to keep the pure red reserved for the next layer. I follow the same rule for the yellow pumpkin on the right, but here it is, for the most part, good enough to simply not use the orange to its purest strength. While the pumpkins dry, I deepen the color on the leaves and define them. I always sharpen the pencil before using them at this point. After sharpening it, I then press harder with a sharp pencil to paint the outlines of the leaves. After activating the watercolor pencil, these lines will still be visible because I did press hard and there's a lot of pigment on the paper there. Even though I use the same light green pencil that I used before for the surface of the leaf, the outer edges now will appear a little darker but still blend in. This is a good opportunity to define some of the outer edges of the stem as well. I darken the stem where it connects with the pumpkin. I also darken the outer edges. The stem is round and darkening the outer edges will make them appear round, or will make the stem appear round. Don't try to be too detailed here, this is not a botanical painting. In my opinion, it is far more important to paint clean edges. The veins are intentionally loose and messy, and I want the pumpkin to be a contrast to that. This will make the pumpkin the focus point of the painting. Let me show you how I like to paint quick and easy backgrounds with watercolor pencils. Watercolor paper dries decently fast, especially if you do not use cotton paper. Especially when the wet spots are small, they dry really fast. Usually, water will sit on top of the paper for a short time before sinking in. I add some clean water to the areas around the pumpkin and veins. Next, I use my brown watercolor pencil to draw lines on the paper, barely touching it. I then use a wet brush to distribute the pigment and move it around a little. I need to work in batches as the paper dries really fast. As soon as the watercolor pencil is touching the wet paper, the pigment immediately activates. Not all of the lines painted this way can be dissolved or blended out. Many are simply too strong to be dissolved, even when you scrub with your brush. They are also too strong to find application in most artworks. Usually, you want softly blended colors. These hard lines are perfect for the background I'm painting right now. Let's start work on the last, the most intense layer of color. In this layer, you could apply the watercolor pencil to the paper and then activate it with water. but I will show you a far more effective way of doing it. First off, the paper needs to be 100% dry or you might accidentally lift paint. Depending on your paper, it might be too flat to accept more layers of pigment when you apply it with a pencil. My paper is not too flat, but not as much pigment will rub off on the paper as it did before. In order for the next steps to work easier, I find it helpful to add some pigment to the paper first regardless. To be precise, I add them to an area around the area which I will darken in this layer. It will help me to blend the next layer. It can also help me to see where my hard lines are. The original pencil lines got painted over, and if the proportions are wrong, the pumpkin will just look wonky. The one side of the shadow there will be a soft blended transition, while on the other side there is a hard edge. The hard edge is where the segment of the pumpkin ends that is casting the shadow, so is visually in front of the other part. Especially in smaller areas like behind the stem, it can be hard to tell the positioning of the hard edges or the original pencil line. It can be helpful here to activate the pigment just to make the hard edges easier to see and make them stand out. Let's begin to actually add water and intensify the shadows. I work in sections here. First, I add water to the center of each segment. This does also activate the watercolor pencil I just added, the one that I added to the flat paper. This will ensure a soft transition. Next, I take some pigment directly off of the pencil with a wet brush. I apply the concentrated pigment directly to the paper to create these really dark shadows. Because of the moist paper around it, it is very easy to blend the concentrated pigment. If I could not use this trick to take pigment directly off of the pencil with a wet brush, I could mix some of the watercolor pencil to create a dark shadow, which is really appropriate for those dark areas. I just don't want to overcomplicate things and introduce another color to this quick illustration. Please let me know in the comments below if you are interested in knowing more about how to mix watercolor pencils, and I will be happy to create a dedicated video. In order to darken the brown stem, I'm also taking pigment directly off of the brush. I apply the pigment to the paper and then blend it out, using the spots where I applied the pigment as a storage for the wet pigment. Applying the pigment with a dry brush or almost dry brush will automatically create this rustic, broken up lines. Using a dry brush really helps this look here. Talking about attention to detail. Now is the perfect time to take a step back and look at the painting and add more details. I use the dark green watercolor pencil for most of them. Keep in mind that there is no need to activate all of them. Talking about details, the vines could really use more. Let's use the dark green watercolor pencil to follow the original vines. The lines do not 100% follow the previous ones. I create another line which crosses over and loosely follows the previous one. The new lines will not be completely activated with water. It will allow for more variation in the structure, adding more detail. Let's talk about how to add the vine which is on top of the pumpkin. I will add the same layers in the same order as I did for the other ones, first the light green and then the dark green. The difference is that I make my life easier by applying them with a brush. I take the pigment directly off of the pencil. I could apply the pencil to the paper, wait for it to dry, apply the next layer, and so on. The problem is that it is likely that the paper is too flat for this to work properly. Not enough pigment from the pencil will rub off onto the paper when I apply it. This might also cause me to pressure harder or rub the pencil over too many times, changing the surface of the paper, or in particular in this very area. And even if adding multiple more layers would work, you could see a big difference in the vines that were added now compared to the ones that were added previously. Adding them with a wet brush is really the best option, as it also allows me to control the amount of pigment I apply. I blend them with the other vines by letting my brush apply some pigment onto the already finished ones. To intensify the green colors, I apply more layers of the dark green watercolor pencil. I also decide to activate it in parts, making the whole painting look more interesting and more vibrant. Thank you so much for watching my video. I picked out some other videos which I think you might like. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and I will see you soon with the next video.